Hi, I'm Bridger Fates, and welcome to Master Stockman's sheep management videos. We're going to do 8 of these videos, cover some topics that should be interesting to all of you, whether you're managing a small farm flock or whether you've got a large range flock like this that we're out here with today. I think you'll find these videos interesting. We've got a good team. Whit Stewart, Dr. Whit Stewart is our sheep specialist, and he's going to cover a lot of ground in these videos. We've also got myself, Bridger Fates. I'll be covering the economics. Bart and Stam will be hitting on the range management topics, and Hudson Hill will be covering a lot of sheep topics as well as focusing on risk management. So that's the team. We hope to do these videos in a little bit more interactive format instead of just a lecture format. So you're going to see some live action like this, you're going to see some lecture, and then you're going to see some roundtable discussion between all of us. So if that's interesting to you, stick around. We've got some great videos on tap for you. In today's episode, our last episode, Dr. Whit Stewart's going to talk to us about managing parasite risk.
A significant animal health challenge in the sheep industry is that posed by internal parasite burdens in sheep flocks. Principal among these is Haemonchus contortus, or what we refer to as the barber pole worm. The purpose of this module is to discuss some of these considerations for how to deal with the barber pole worm and to integrate a more holistic strategy to managing internal parasites. A really good resource that has late-breaking information on internal parasite control in both sheep and goats is the American Consortium for Small Ruminant Parasite Control. This website not only highlights the research being conducted, but also lays summaries of best management practices with internal parasites. Regional considerations matter when dealing with internal parasites, especially based on the broad climatic differences that exist in the continental US. As mentioned, I'm going to highlight the barber pole worm and some of those worms that will affect the abomasum and small intestine, but there's numerous internal and external parasites. And consulting with your veterinarian, your extension specialists, and extension personnel can help you integrate a strategy that is specific to your region. The barber pole worm, as given the common name by its appearance, is one of the most important gastrointestinal nematodes affecting sheep on pasture, especially irrigated pasture. It damages the functionality of the digestive system so that not only are decreased performances observed in sheep, but also can result in mortality. One adult worm can consume about 0.05 mils per day. And in a clinically parasitized ewe or sheep, we can see up to 5,000 worms, which would consume approximately 1 cup of blood per day. Although that we often attribute the losses to the barber pole worm simply in death loss, it's important that there's decreased production that is costing our operation valuable resources. One of these hands-on tools that can add value to your parasite management toolbox is the Haemonchus scoring system. This system looks at the ocular membrane of the sheep and has a score of 1 to 5. On this chart here, it shows the ranges where we would want to administer an anthelmintic or dewormer to our sheep based off the ocular score. Scores of 3 to 5 would merit a deworming treatment. This selective deworming tool requires some practice and training, but it is based on the principle that a certain amount of internal parasites will eventually gain resistance to our anthelmintic treatments. By selecting those animals that are only clinically parasitized, as evidenced by their anemia score in the Haemonchus system, allows us to make sure that we don't treat in mass, and eventually allows us to maintain populations of worms from sheep that haven't been treated to continue to be responsive to those deworming treatments. There's many trainings in your area that may be offered. This is a system that is becoming more popular and more widespread, especially in the US, which have been slow adopters. Reaching out and having opportunities to participate in these Haemonchus trainings or reaching out to your extension personnel to host some would be a valuable tool for you in the sheep industry in your area. There are other clinical signs of parasitism in addition to mortality. Diarrhea, bottle jaw or edema underneath the jaw, poor body condition, abnormal fleece or hair coat, intolerance and sluggishness on pasture, all can be other clinical signs of parasitism in addition to the Haemonchus scoring system. Sheep that are affected with the barber pole worm in a clinical case will undergo various changes to their physiological function. Most important among these are the damages done to the digestive system that contribute to the reduced performance that we observe. Resistance to common dewormers has been an ongoing problem and emerging problem. Early estimates relative to North America and the United States show that there's widespread resistance to many of our classes of dewormers, and that this problem is only going to get worse as time progresses. Barber pole worm can overwinter in the digestive tract of the animal. It's not likely, under many of the more high snowfall environments, that L3 larvae will survive in the fecal pellet. However, it can be possible under certain circumstances. More likely is the overwintering as adult worms inside the animal. Using dewormers that are still effective and knowing which dewormers are still effective require more effort on your operation. It's important to keep in mind that we are strictly discussing barber pole worm. However, Telathersacia, Trichostrongylis, and nematode iris parasite species are able to overwinter on pasture, especially in northern climates. Research was conducted with the University of Wyoming, Montana State University, and the National Center for Appropriate Technology in Butte, Montana. We wanted to understand better resistant to common classes of dewormers in the Intermountain West to better inform our management strategies. This picture here is indicative of some of the sampling that we conducted across Montana and Wyoming and Utah. Oftentimes, irrigated or sub-irrigated pastures can be hospitable environments for gastrointestinal nematode growth. Our project objectives were to determine how prevalent resistant was with barber pole worm species across flocks in Montana and Wyoming. We wanted to characterize grazing risk factors and other management risk factors that may contribute to resistance observed in these flocks, with the end goal of developing regionally specific information to help guide the recommendations which we provide to producers, both in small and large flocks in the region. Our principal question and most relevant question was, which dewormers in our toolbox are still going to be effective on worm populations in our flock? As mentioned previously, during the summer months, due to the climatic conditions, barber pole worm represented the majority of parasites present in the sampled flocks in the study, with approximately 70% of the parasite species present belonging to the barber pole worm category, indicated that perhaps this is more of a challenge than we initially anticipated in our region. We saw a broad degree of variation of fecal egg counts, but interestingly, those that were irrigated, either flood or sprinkler, had higher eggs per gram fecal egg counts than those on the sub-irrigated flocks. The decision to deworm or not to deworm or selectively deworm is dependent on the parasite species present on our operations. Results from our study showed that Haemonchus contortus was the most prominent internal parasite species across operations. Using a larval development assay to estimate resistance, we found that 92% of the ranches sampled were resistant to the benzimidazoles. 50% of the ranches were resistant to ivermectin, yet only 8% of the ranches sampled were resistant to the moxidectins. Some additional considerations when managing pasture, especially on irrigated or sub-irrigated acres, includes making sure that you have a good pasture rotation strategy. Oftentimes, given the production potential of these irrigated pastures, we will often see higher stocking density. A good strategy to rest pasture and make sure that the life cycle of the barber pole worm is exhausted, approximately 30 to 40 days of pasture rest, can help reduce the risk of reingestion of the larva. Making sure that you have a dewormer and that you use this selectively, utilizing the FAMANCHA scoring system and other clinical signs, can help make sure that the dewormer that you are using has a greater shelf life and a greater lifespan on your operation. Understanding your climatic conditions that are most conducive to barber pole worm growth are important considerations as well. Following large rainfall events, which are not always common in arid production systems, but are common across many regions in the US, following large rainfall events and warm temperatures present optimal temperatures for larval migration on plant surfaces. Understanding the optimal temperature ranges for various parasite species is another consideration that allows you to implement site-specific strategies on your farm or ranch. This review paper from O'Connor et al. In 2006 shows the various temperature ranges that are optimal for various classes of internal parasite species. There are numerous climate tools available that allow us to estimate what the optimal temperatures would exist in our area for this barber pole worm growth. This information can be accessed at crt-climate-explorer.nemac.org. This interactive website allows you to pick various data points in the region where you are located and estimate parameters such as mean average temperatures, max temperatures, minimum temperatures, all of which can inform your ability to estimate when you would experience the highest parasite risk in your grazing system. Looking at an example from Uinta County, Wyoming, you can see that optimal temperature range for Haemonchus contortus at this specific high elevation southwestern Wyoming location is approximately the middle of June to the end of August. In other portions of the country, in more temperate climates, we would see a more conducive temperature range throughout greater portions of the year. Some additional management considerations include understanding the classes of sheep that may be most prone to parasite challenges in your operation. Additional factors that may be considered when dealing with internal parasite issues are understanding the various stages of production in our flock where animals may be susceptible to this clinical illness. Ewes had greatest fecal egg counts in this study in Katahdin ewes at approximately 28 days post-lambing. That also coincides with peak lactation and the increased physiological demands on those ewes. Yearling ewes in this study also had higher fecal egg counts than adult ewes, indicating that animals that are still growing and developing may be more susceptible to internal parasite challenges. Lambs in this study from 60 to 120 days were also highly susceptible to internal parasite burdens. And finally, those first-time lambing ewes that were raising lambs or raising multiple lambs also showed greater fecal egg counts. It's important to keep an eye on those animals most at risk so that we can minimize those losses in the more susceptible animal populations. Additional management considerations include determining whether you have parts of your operation that are more susceptible to internal parasite issues. For example, do you maintain sheep on irrigated acres for a part of the year? Are there sub-irrigated meadows perhaps that you are grazing that allow these animals to become infested with internal parasites? Understanding that irrigated pastures and irrigated operations are more susceptible to barber pole issues than our extensively managed range operations is a good first step. Utilizing your diagnostic testing, in addition to the recommendations previously mentioned with Fumantia scoring and selective treatment, allow us to make informed decisions in those animal health inputs that we oftentimes will spend money on. For example, utilizing your veterinary diagnostic lab and taking a fecal sample will allow you to determine what types of parasites are present at various time points of the year at a very low price point. Also, if determining that administering a dewormer is going to be required, it's important that when using benzimidazoles or our white wormers, that we fast use approximately 24 hours prior to administration, and that will also help drug efficacy. There is a cost associated with these animal health inputs. Valbazin, Safeguard, Ivermectin, Prohibit, Cydectin are all various trade classes of dewormers that come at different price points. It's not only important to look at what broad spectrum of parasites those treatments will cover, but also understanding your cost per dose. This further illustrates the importance of making sure that we have informed diagnostic information at various time points of the year when we're working sheep, so that these inputs are not wasted or administered to animals that do not have parasite burdens. As previously mentioned, the Fumantia scoring system is a way for us to identify sheep that are clinically parasitized by the barber pole worm. This system does not allow us to identify parasite issues across other worm species, but as previously mentioned, the greatest risk during the summer months is the barber pole worm, and using both diagnostic testing in addition to selective treatment strategies will ensure that the dewormers that we have in our toolbox will continue to be efficacious into the future. Once again, I'd encourage you, if you are tuning in a region that has not commonly offered Fumantia trainings, that you reach out to your regional land-grant institution or others to help implement a training program so that this can be utilized more effectively in your region.
So when it comes to parasite management, are there some differences between managing parasites on irrigated pastures versus some of our arid rangeland type operations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a major differentiation between our farm flocks that graze on irrigated or sub-irrigated meadows versus those that are never going to hit the same blade of grass twice in our range flocks. And so I think understanding that those warm, humid conditions in an irrigated pasture are really conducive to the growth of internal parasites. The one that's most of concern to us would be the barber pole worm, which is a warm season internal parasite. In our area, generally it takes about 55 degrees minimum temperature overnight for that larva to be active. And in our area, we see that in June, July, and August. And in our range flocks, not so much, but there's still reason to make sure that they keep an eye on what is out there. There's some cool season internal parasites that
doing a fecal aid count, sending that to your diagnostic lab can kind of help you see what you have in advance of working events.
So Whit, you know, looking at it from somebody who hasn't been really involved at that level, it seems to me that parasite control didn't change a lot, and now it's changed some, and there's a lot of discrepancy about that. For someone who was just trying to get involved and just trying to get started, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, I think staying abreast of the most recent research, which is through the American Consortium of Small Ruminant Parasite Control. They produce late-breaking research that has really evolved over time. With that, I think one misconception is that oftentimes producers will rotate dewormers like we would do in our fly tags and external parasite control, and that's definitely something that we've discovered is detrimental. We want to keep sheep selectively treated so the worm populations are naive to those drugs, and that the 4 classes of dewormers that we broadly have will still be effective over time. There's other things, but I think keeping working knowledge of that late-breaking research through the consortium is a good way to get some of that information too.
So you mentioned that we're really looking at those warm, humid conditions. What are the other times of year, if any, that we're worried about some of those parasites like the barber pole, or is it really just a summertime issue?
Yeah, so some of the overwintering that we see is predominantly from an adult worm overwintering in the digestive system of the sheep. And so making sure that we're using a dewormer that works, and there's different strategies to do that, but making sure that the dewormer that you're using will kill those burdens is really important so that you don't have that carryover across seasons. The other thing I'd recommend, I think, is doing some testing in advance of those major working events. Now that's easier said than done for larger flock or smaller flocks or larger flocks, but I think it's important to keep in mind that if we can use a diagnostic test to tell us what kind of parasites we have and how many, then we can selectively treat more effectively. And the last answer to that, I think, is making sure that we use some subclinical tools to tell us whether they have parasites or not. And there's the FOMACHA scoring system, which looks at the lower eyelid, the ocular membrane, to see how much anemia those animals are experiencing, and from that we can say how parasitized they are. So I think really keeping an eye on those tools in the summer months, going back to your question, is really important so that we don't lose those production points with our sheep.
Yeah, I think of the many things that we've talked about in these videos, this tool for risk management in terms of managing parasite load in your flock is really one of the tools that pencils out on paper every time you do it, kind of a deal. It's by the time you calculate the losses you get from production, it really makes a lot of sense to look at and manage the parasite load in your ranch, and to keep up with up-to-date information and make sure you're utilizing the best methods. But you can even sit down and use one of the ranch tools, use the partial budget, put pen to pencil, or put pencil to paper, or keys to keyboard on the ranch tools, and it'll really pay off most of the time.
Yeah, 50 cents to $1 a dose for a deworming treatment at $3 a pound lamb, I think it's a no-brainer.
Yeah, even at less on the lamb,
Yeah,
it's still a pretty foolproof strategy. So, well, thanks a lot. We appreciate you for watching. We appreciate the USDA Risk Management Agency for partially funding these videos. One thing that would really help us, if you'll hit the like button if you like it, and also comment down below. Let us know what you think. Let us know how you might use some of these tools. Let us know other video topics that you might want to watch. Again, we really appreciate you watching this video. We hope you enjoyed the other videos in this series, and we hope you'll enjoy the next videos as we begin to release those.